Hey everyone, welcome to the EsportsNext podcast. I am thrilled to be joining as the host for season 3 along with my co-hosts. We are going to be interviewing speakers, sponsors, and attendees of the Esports Trade Association conference in Chicago. So if you're looking to understand who will be at the conference and what they're all about, tune in, come join us. All right, welcome to another episode of the EsportsNext podcast. I am here with my co-host Megan Van Petten, and today our guest is Brett Diamonds, COO of Version 1, fielding a number of esports teams across the esports landscape, and a frequent attendee and speaker of the EsportsNext conference in Chicago. Thank you for joining us, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for Megan. Great to be back here with you.
And
Absolutely.
Sponsor, John. And sponsor.
Forgive me. Speaker, sponsor, and attendee. You know, on this podcast, we're talking to all groups, all these three groups, and with just you're a 3-in-1, Brett.
Yes.
You're doing all of those things. So we greatly appreciate you. You know, when I think about Version 1, you know, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is Minneapolis and how you guys have really put your stake in the ground in an area where professional esports wasn't really officially organized. Take us back a few years to when V1 was formed, and what was that like, and kind of what has that been like over the last few years, building and engaging that community?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great place to start. And when we think about Version 1 and Minnesota Rocker, which is our Call of Duty team, you know, Rocker is really the one that's focused on the Midwest, Minnesota first and foremost, but also we started to do things in Wisconsin and looking to branch out to other nearby states. And I'll get into more detail on that in a second. You know, for Version 1, we view Version 1 as a national brand. There's certainly, we certainly lean into opportunities that are in our backyard. We are based in the suburbs of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we have, you know, we have roots here. We sponsor the local high school leagues across multiple titles, including some titles that we're not even in because we want to support that grassroots effort. Under Rocker, we've been very active in building that local fan base, not just in Minnesota, but we did an event in Madison, Wisconsin a few weeks ago, where we had 2 other CDL teams come in, and it's part of and I'll probably get into more detail on this because it's something we think is really interesting for the future of the industry and that I'm personally passionate about. But we had 2 teams come to Madison. We did what would normally be online qualifiers in person, and had a very successful event there. And so that's part of a broader strategy when we think about how do you continue to build, you know, a local and regional fan base of having a presence in markets that are right. You know, Madison is where the University of Wisconsin is. That's a natural place to plant a flag if you're looking to build a regional fan base in the Midwest. You know, and as you alluded to, there hasn't been a lot of, prior to Rocker being established a few years ago, there really hadn't been much of an esports presence in this region. There, nothing near Minnesota in terms of at the professional and tier 1 level. There have been a few events in Chicago, and LCS had their finals there last season. So there's you certainly get big events that come through Chicago periodically. But generally speaking, the entire region is very underserved from an esports standpoint relative to, certainly relative to, LA, Dallas, certain cities on the East Coast. So we've seen a lot of success in starting to plant the flag. And personally, I think that the Minnesota Rocker fans are the best fans in the CDL, and that fan base is, obviously you're always going to have Optic, which is going to be way up here, right? In Call of Duty,
Sure.
Like nobody can compete with them. But from a local standpoint, outside of what Optic has, we think that we've seen the passion that we've seen out of Rocker fans is has been pretty special and pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think there's a dynamic there in Minneapolis that's similar to the esports industry at large, which is being undersupported, right? And so I think when we look at sponsors and stuff like that, we have a lot of those topics at our EsportsNext conference. A lot of what we talk about is a brand coming in and supporting a community that has not been supported increases loyalty, right? Because they've been desiring this, but not getting it from anywhere. And so when I take that down to a local level, you're saying the Minneapolis area specifically, that, you know, Chicago had the Optic House, and, you know, you've got obviously LA, New York, Atlanta, Dallas, Las Vegas. But what has been your experience from the community when you put your stake in the ground with Rocker version 1 and said, we're here for the competitive gaming community? Did they just come out of the woodwork like you wouldn't expect, or something different?
Yeah, there's certainly an interest in it, and you know, I think all brands recognize that there's intriguing things with esports that they want to explore further. So it's not very hard to get that first conversation and to start the dialogue about it. You know, there can still be challenges if, you know, depending on kind of where in the, you know, in the level of decision making, there might be somebody that is still a little bit skeptical about you know, how that fits in with their companies, and it, you know, it varies a little bit by game title, etc. But in my opinion, like, there's no question that within the next few years, all brands that have significant marketing budgets will be looking at esports the same way they look at traditional sports today, where not every brand has a traditional sports sponsorship and a part of that is their portfolio. But any brand that has a significant marketing budget and significant, you know, is trying to reach, you know, a certain consumer demographic, they consider traditional sports sponsorships as part of their marketing plan. That's where esports will get to in the next few years. You know, and we've seen a number of situations where, you know, we've well over delivered on what our partners' expectations were in terms of like the dollar spent relative to what they got out of it. And anytime we're talking to anyone, it's all, you know, you have to establish the right, you know, you know, parameters for the conversation and the right, put in the right context. But, you know, in my opinion, you know, with an organization like ours, you can, as a brand, you can get dollar for dollar as effective, if not more effective, marketing spend than on almost anything else you're going to do. Particularly if you're trying to reach a younger demographic, that's really hard to reach through, you know, almost any traditional advertising market. And, you know, I think what we'll see over the next couple of years, not just as brands get more comfortable with esports and gaming more broadly as a marketing vehicle, you know, but brands are starting to get a better understanding of things that they've spent money on in the past, isn't necessarily as effective as it used to be, whether that's, you know, TV ads, you know, certain areas of digital marketing, websites, banner ads, etc., that were, you know, that just aren't proving to be as effective as, you know, as they might have been a few years ago.
Well, boy, Brett, thank you for that. The Midwest and the nation, for that matter, is so lucky to have you. And me especially. I mean, this is your third time that version 1 is making their way to Chicago to support us as a gold sponsor, and we're so delighted to have you. Tell us a little bit about, you know, your experience at EsportsNext and what you'd like to see from EsportsNext this year.
Yeah, well, the conference does a great job in bringing people together, not just from our industry, but people that are interested in learning more about esports. And that's something that's always impressed me every year, the number of people that are attending the conference to really learn about the space to begin with. That's been interesting for me personally over time, having now been in this role for, it'll actually be 4 years next month. But one of the first people I talked to when I took on this role was John, where we met at an event and chatted a little bit. And right from that first conversation, John was, you know, a great resource for me personally as I was starting to learn the space. And at that point, I was very much in just like have as many conversations as possible, just listen, just absorb things. You know, I think that kind of openness to bringing people in that might be new to the esports and gaming world. I think you feel that at the conference as well. So it's been interesting for me to go kind of over the last few years from being very new to the space to now having a little bit of experience, a couple of years in. But it's always great to get to reconnect with people in the industry, whether they're people that you've known for a while and are coming out, or people that are new and just looking to take their first steps into understanding the esports and gaming world a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm curious, you come from the most popular sport in the US, most popular traditional sport in the NFL. Coming over to esports, obviously you have this very robust youth passion dynamic where every kid is a gamer. A lot of them are playing competitive games. Like you touched on, not engaging with traditional media, traditional sports nearly as much. I'm curious, what part of the esports industry is the part that you are most excited about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's just it really is, like being at the start of a frontier, right? Like where everything we're doing is new and different. And, there's, that can be there. I think there's sort of two different kinds of mindsets, and at least from what I've seen in whether it's people that I've talked to, or people we've interviewed for jobs along the way, or whatever the case may be, where you get people that are excited and motivated by that unknown, and see the ambiguity that can exist in an emerging space, any emerging space, an industry, as a challenge that you want to embrace. Or it can be something that is, that can be a little intimidating at times. And from the start, to your point on coming from the NFL, I spent 11 years in the NFL at the league level, working primarily in their events department, worked on some of the biggest sporting events in the world: Super Bowls, Pro Bowls, NFL drafts. Went to the Vikings for a few years in their sponsorship department. But coming into esports, and now again, this is 3-4 years ago, it was really important, whether it was for me personally or our ownership group's mindset, primarily the Will family, who owns the Minnesota Vikings, as well as soccer teams in Orlando. We weren't coming in saying, hey, we have all the answers for esports just because we've had some success in traditional sports or at the NFL level. It was more about, all right, let's observe, let's listen, let's learn, let's just try to consume as much information as possible, whether that's, I referenced earlier our early conversation, John, whether it was, conversations with people in the industry, tried to consume a tremendous amount of just content about the titles that we're in. And that's still something where, if we're looking at getting into a new title, the first thing I'll try to do is figure out, like, okay, who are the big personalities in that title? Just start listening to their content on a daily basis, and you just start to, slowly over time. It doesn't happen. It's not like, okay, I listened to, one podcast and now I'm good to go. Like it takes time to get that, to gain an understanding. And then, once we spent several months just really in just listen and learn mode, there was a point where, all right, we're now establishing Minnesota Rocker. We have a Call of Duty League team. We need to start executing. And then we built out a really talented staff where we were trying to take a very intentional approach of drawing people that had esports experience. We didn't hire that many people that came from traditional sports because we felt like we had that out of the gate, but over time, we certainly did. But really trying from day one to find a good balance of having staff that came from esports, came from traditional sports, it came from other areas of either marketing, social and digital agencies, other areas of entertainment and media, to just bring different perspectives together, and just bounce them around, right? And everybody checks their ego at the door, and you really think about, okay, how do we just share ideas? And it's not like, okay, we're going to do this because we did this at the Vikings around the Super Bowl 5 years ago or something like that. It's like, all right, here's an idea, here's something that one of us had seen work in a past life, and then kind of bounce it around and see how we can adapt it, and then ultimately make sure that if we go forward with an idea, that it makes sense the esports community and the community specific to whichever title we're talking about. And that's where we've seen our most success, where it wasn't about replicating something that had been done specifically before, but replicating something and then putting the right spin on it for the community we're trying to reach.
I think it's so cool that you have such a traditional sports background, so many years. What do you see as, the trends or the like what's different for you from traditional to esports?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously with esports, we're talking about a much younger audience, but as much as that's just self-evident in everything that we do, occasionally when I'll go to either a traditional sports conference or meet with kind of my counterparts that or colleagues that I know from my traditional sports roles in the past, it's so stark how different that is, that a traditional sports team is still talking to a fan who has an average age of, in their 50s or 60s. And that's inherent, like, that's not something that's a surprise, right? Like, we know that, but having those conversations or going to a traditional sports conference and just like seeing that firsthand, it's so stark what a difference that is. And I think that's one of the, back to one of the earlier questions, like that's the really exciting part about everything we do, because we're really just doing things very differently. And you have to think differently than a traditional sports team might. But you're also seeing some really successful things in traditional sports that are taking a page directly out of the esports playbook. And an example that I use regularly is the Manning cast, which has been a really successful companion broadcast to Monday Night Football. I don't know if, when they were sitting around in a boardroom, at ESPN headquarters in Bristol, Connecticut, if they were actually looking at esports comparisons, but like that basic concept of having a former player or an influencer or a big personality watch the game and have a little bit more of just a personal, casual vibe to it, that's something that's been successful in esports for years and is very foundational to a lot of things in esports. And now you're seeing that start to make its way to traditional sports, where the Manning cast was obviously got a lot of headlines and was done at a very high level. It's been experimented now with multiple different traditional sports leagues and broadcasts in their playoffs. And there's a successful companion broadcast in a similar fashion around the women's Final Four this year. So there you see that more and more. And that's, again, just takes, without knowing whether, they actually looked at esports and said, hey, this is happening over here. Let's talk here. It is clearly the same basic concept. And it gets to what I think we all see, that younger audiences are more attracted to individual personalities than they necessarily are, the brands themselves or even the teams and that sort of thing. That's something that is, we see those trends across multiple different areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can definitely echo the personality aspect there, where typically it's like, hey, where I'm from, I'm cheering for that team and I don't care who the players are, and when that player leaves my city, I burn that jersey and I buy the new one and XYZ. And so I think that in esports, those geographically located teams, like in CDL, like in OWL, did not exist. And so rather than attaching yourself to where you're from geographically, it's this player who either I love his style, or he's the best, or I love this streamer's personality, sort of a thing. I'm curious because that puts a lot of pressure on teams, right? When all the fans are more closely associated with their players and they're going with them versus staying with the team, is kind of what we see in esports. From a team perspective, I'm curious if you can kind of concisely give a challenge or two that needs a solution, and then where are you optimistic in this space long term? What are you seeing as a silver lining?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that dynamic that you mentioned of fans being more attached to players than they are to teams in esports. And I think I think there are a number of things that are unique to esports, and then a number of things that are not necessarily unique, but sort of come together that make that more likely, right? Like, I think I think younger people in general are more likely to be, to be supporting like an individual brand or an individual player than they are teams. Like you see that, I think particularly in the NBA, because that's more of a like star-driven personality league relative to the other traditional sports. So it's really not something that's unique in esports. But I think when you have, number one, that the entire esports audience, or the vast majority of it, are people that are under the age of 30. You got a couple of people that are a couple of years older, like us, but for the most part, it's that younger audience. So it's more concentrated in people that are more likely to take that point of view. Then you have the reality that it's only in the last couple of years, and in some cases it still doesn't necessarily happen, but it's really only the last couple of years that you've had more consistency in rosters where you even see players staying with the same teams year over year, right? If you go back a few years in esports, it was pretty rare that more than one player stayed on a roster for more than one season, right? So that naturally makes it less likely that fans are going to support the team brand versus the individual, right? If they just assume that, hey, I like this player, he's going to be on a different team every year, it's a lot easier for me to just cheer for this player than it is cheer for the team. Ultimately, as a team, you need to try to do both, right? So like, we are certainly trying to build brand affinity for our teams. And particularly, we have the local angle with Rocker that we went into a little bit with version 1. But then we need to find ways to appeal to the fans of our individual players, give them a reason to support the team brand itself. Really, it's about giving them a good experience if they enjoy our content, if they like coming out to our events, that's part of why we try to show up in a big way when our teams are playing in LANs outside of our region. We've developed a reputation for showing up at particularly Rocket League LANs. We've done a lot of had a lot of events around around the main event when our teams have gone. Those are the types of things that we think about, like, how do we give fans a reason to become fans of Rocker and version 1 if they came in as fans of our players, and then if down the road the players go somewhere else, hopefully they continue to be a fan of our team, even if they also stay as a fan of that player. And you also see it's more common, I think, in our space for fans to support multiple teams than it necessarily is in traditional sports. And there's a number of different reasons for that. I got way down that rabbit hole on like the individual fan thing.
Okay.
When you think about how the esports industry looks in the future and reasons to be optimistic, like there's no question that there's an audience there right now. It's just a matter of figuring out what the right business model around that is and how do you grow it in the future. So for example, the NHL playoffs just started. And I was curious, so I looked at some numbers. If you really did the math on, and I'll use TNT as the example. So the NHL regular season games on TNT average like in the mid 300,000s in viewers, right? They had 61 games on TNT. If you do the math on that and get to an hours watched number, that's about the same number of hours watched that Call of Duty League will have over the course of the season. So there are multiple different ways to look at comparisons to traditional sports viewership that is actually pretty favorable with esports. Now, what you don't have in esports is you don't have the broadcast networks and the platforms willing to pay significant rights fees yet.
Right.
And that has challenged the economic model.
Yeah, that's an operative word.
And John's going to charge a fortune when they do.
But, and that's the key thing to remember, right? It's so like everyone gets so caught up in like, where is the industry right now today on, as opposed to where is it going to be in 5 or 10 years? And it's a balance, right? Because as organizations, and whether you're in a leadership position or, when we're having conversations with our ownership group or the collective ownership groups of the leagues we're in, we have to find a way to run a business now with the economics that exist that are a reality for us today. And sometimes you have to make decisions that are relevant from a business standpoint in 2023 or for the next 2 or 3 years. And you're seeing multiple organizations kind of handle, esports winter in different ways and approach these things in different ways. But there's no question in my mind that if you fast forward 10 years, esports as a whole and multiple titles will be among the premier sports and entertainment properties in the world. How it gets from here to there and how, like, at what point in that evolution, we build a long-term sustainable business model around it. That's the part that doesn't happen overnight, and didn't happen overnight in traditional sports. Like the NFL is 104 years old, right? If you think about where MLS was in the late 90s and early 2000s, like it was a league that, was not, nobody back then referred to there being 5 major sports in North America. Now nobody says 4, everybody says 5, and some would say more than 5, because to MLS's credit, they have built that league into something that, that is viewed as a premier sports and entertainment property. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, right? It didn't happen by magic. There were, they had to build that over time and make smart business decisions and have the right people involved at all levels to make it work. So, when we think about back to like the media rights piece, because that's kind of a, I'd say if you look at like esports revenue streams compared to traditional revenue streams, that's one that, stands out as very, very prominent in traditional sports, but not necessarily yet a significant revenue stream in esports. The big difference is, and this is the way I've described it to a few people that aren't necessarily in the esports scene. And I want to date myself a little bit, though I was pretty young when some of this happened.
This is so rich, Brett. I love it. You really are.
If I'm too far down the rabbit hole, just stop me.
You're not. It's appreciated.
Yeah.
It's appreciated. I think we should have you, have Brett's Corner in our newsletter or something.
I'll at the conference, if you want me to do the history of media rights relative to traditional sports and esports, I'm happy to. But so you think about, early 90s was really a turning point in sports media rights in general. And in that time frame, you had Fox that was just coming on the scene as a new challenger network to ABC, CBS, and NBC. So prior to that, it had just been like basically 3 broadcast networks. Yeah, people had cable, but it was that wasn't necessarily an area. They weren't paying a lot for sports rights. And I'm mostly talking about the NFL because it's what I know instinctively, right? But I think it applies broadly to other sports leagues as well. So early 90s, Fox comes in and pays a significant rights fee to get the NFC package of NFL games. And that really like changed the dynamic in traditional sports, because you went from having, prior to that, there were basically 3 bidders for NFL media rights. Cable was sort of a thing then, but really functionally you had the 3 broadcast networks. Once that started to get disrupted, now you had more competition for those rights. So that starts to drive the price up. A couple of years after that, ESPN comes in, starts broadcasting what was then Sunday Night Football. Eventually, obviously, that became their package moved to Monday Night Football. But over time, that having multiple bidders for the media rights helped to drive that up in all sports. And then once you started to get, obviously now, MLS is working with Apple, the NFL has games on Amazon. That's just continuing to grow and grow and grow. In esports right now, you really only have Twitch and YouTube. Only YouTube is willing to pay any sort of media rights. And for, from as great as YouTube's reach is from a live esports perspective, the viewership is far less than what you see on Twitch. And we're living that in Call of Duty League, this year. And so
Yeah.
like the status quo in 2023 does not favor significant media rights for for the broadcasts. But while it's hard to like look at the status quo and say, oh yeah, it'll definitely change at a certain point in time, over time these things always change, right? Like there's no way that 10 years from now the status quo is exactly the same way it is today. But
Right.
so once that status quo changes, that's when we'll start to see, I think, more movement on things like media rights. And that'll happen eventually, but we also have to operate businesses in the reality of 2023. And so that's something that that everybody is approaching in their own way.
Yeah. Well, that's an appreciative insight that you have there, Brett. Thank you for that history and your wisdom. You most certainly are a great, and the industry is lucky to have you. I can say that one of my happiest moments is when I scan the room at the conference. I always look for you at the WIT. I always look for you at the end, and I always look for your face, and I could just see how happy and proud you always are for our Midwest event. And it always makes my day. And you know what? I scan and I stop, and there you are. I'm just going to say, as a woman in esports, I respect greatly how version 1 supports women in both leadership and professional competitors. Tell us about your commitment to women. I've met as part of your leadership team, and then there's other things that you wanted to discuss about that and how you shaped version 1.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we were really fortunate that in the early days, we hired a lot of really talented people, and 2 of our first 3 hires happened to be women, being Annie Scott Riley, who is our chief marketing officer, and Ashley Glassell, better known to some as Midnight, who is our director of content. She was an OG in the Call of Duty scene, goes back to like the early days of Optic. And so we're fortunate to bring those 2 in as a key part of our staff, like right from the start. I was employee number 1,
Yeah.
Ashley was employee number 2, Annie was employee number 3. And from there, I don't know that there's really anything we kind of did that stands out as we did differently, other than, we just tried to create an environment where, where everybody could have their voice heard and had a seat at the table. And, so fast forward a few years, our leadership team, which we refer to as director level and above here, is over 50% women. Our organization as a whole across all levels is about 50%. It's kind of always been like right about that 50% mark. So, that's been something that's really been just part of our identity, naturally from the start. In terms of the competitive teams, so our Valorant team is an all women's Valorant team, competes in both women specific events, the Game Changer series that Riot has, as well as open events that have men's teams as well, or co-ed teams as well. And they just won the first North American regional event for the Game Changer circuit, kind of rolled through without dropping a map. So, the ambition for that team is to win a world championship in Game Changers, and also compete in open events. And they made some noise in the qualifiers for the Valorant tier 2 scene. Ultimately didn't qualify for that for that circuit, but definitely gave some teams a run for their money there. So I know every player on that team, their ambition is to play at the highest level of competitive Valorant in the world. So they don't view themselves as limited to anything really, but certainly not just women specific leagues or teams. And from an organization standpoint, like that's something that we hope to support them on while they're a part of our organization, and nothing would make me happier than whether it's 6 months from now, a year from now, or further into the future, any of the players that are currently on our Valorant team are ultimately playing in playing for one of the teams in the Valorant Partnership Program. And I think, several of the players that are on our team have that, potential.
Yeah, I love that.
And also one thing I'll add there, and, for us, like we want to provide like the same level of like when we got into women's Valorant, it was important to us that we provide the same level of support, same level of passion and energy as an organization for all our teams. And that's kind of something that we think about anytime we were exploring a new title. It was important to us to make sure that we could make that commitment ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I have one last question for you, Brett. If I'm listening to this, I'm probably trying to figure out, should I come to the EsportsNext conference in Chicago at the end of August? And so my question for you, as you are operating an esports organization, as you are working through developing, profitable business models and optimistic about the future, who are the types of people and the types of companies who you would be looking to meet and interact with at this conference, so that when they hear that, they say, you know what, I got to be there?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we talked about a little bit earlier, I think the conference is a great entry point for those who are new to the esports scene. So particularly, brands, agencies that are looking to learn more about it and get that sort of base level understanding, get to, meet people that are part of the scene, start to just really gain that deeper understanding. I think the conference is extremely valuable for anybody that fits that description. I also think it's a great opportunity for, whether it's, people who work for orgs like myself, others in the space to, come together, hear from your colleagues, hear best practices, hear what's going on in the industry. And then I think we all still, I don't want to speak for everybody, but there's still, it's still nice to get together in person with people after having to, not be able to do that for a couple of years. So there's certainly an element there of, enjoying each other's company that, that we weren't able to do for a few years.
Yeah.
I can definitely agree with that. Well, Brett, it's been fantastic to have you with us here today. Megan, thank you so much for joining us. We're just really looking forward to getting everybody together August 21st, 22nd for EsportsNext in Chicago, and looking forward to one of our next conversations being in person, my friend.
Sounds good. Yeah, looking forward to it.
That's right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Brett.
All right. Thank you.